to move over to Marissa, who will give a recap of some of the partner work and that the chapter is doing with others around Mach 2 engagements around hydrogen. So Marissa, I'll kick it over to you, and I'll pull back up our slide deck.
All righty. And thanks, folks, for staying with us. This has been a really great evening so far. So a little bit of introduction. My name is Marissa McClinton. I'm the Environmental Justice Associate Organizer with the Sierra Club Delaware chapter. I've been here for about a year and a half. And so just going to talk a little bit about our chapter's engagement with Mach 2 and hydrogen so far. So the biggest way that we engage with it right now is that we are part of a coalition led by the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I know some of those folks are here on the call right now. Really appreciate y'all for coming out. It includes environmental advocates from all across the region, and even I've seen across the country, folks who do work kind of nationwide around hydrogen. And we all have kind of similar concerns about the Mid-Atlantic Hydrogen Hub, mainly around the lack of community engagement and transparency that we're seeing with the hubs. So environmental justice is what I do. And so I look at everything through the lens of EJ. And when we look at our energy transition, it's really important that folks are engaged early, often, and equitably in the decisions that we're making around our energy transition. And so when that comes to Mach 2, one of the things that folks have continuously advocated for was, like I said, transparency and community engagement in the hubs. And so folks of the coalition have done a really great job of organizing things like sign-on letters and meeting with legislators to share concerns about the lack of community engagement, but also about our concerns with hydrogen, whether it be end uses, production, all that good stuff, making sure that our voices are heard on the same level as other folks engaged in the processes. We also create materials for legislators about the realities of a hydrogen as a fuel source. So we don't expect our legislators to be knowledgeable about hydrogen. It's an emerging technology. This is just not, like, I don't expect them to be scientists. I don't really want them to be scientists. They have a job to do. And so at the Sierra Club, a lot of our job is translating those really technical concepts to legislators so that when things come up, whether they're under the guise of low carbon fuels or just hydrogen, capital H, they know and have a baseline understanding of what people are talking about and what to look out for with that build out. So this is also included doing a lot of just keeping our eyes out about rezonings about hydrogen. There was some that happened around the refinery. Hydrogen's in a really interesting, like, regulatory position, I would say. There's a lot of stuff that's not figured out yet. And so the chapter has had to be really, I would say, cognizant and aware of different rezonings and bills that are being introduced and all of that stuff, not introduced, but proposed to make it easier for hydrogen build out that might not be coming with the proper community engagement and transparency that we want to see in order to feel comfortable with the steps moving forward. So we're very much in the phase right now of educating. Thank you all for being here. This is a really big step in that process. So I want to educate both community members and legislators, but also folks who are also stakeholders about the environmental implications of these new technologies. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to do questions for Marissa and myself at the same time at the end. So we're going to keep on going. Again, just briefly, I'm Dustin. I'm the chapter director here in Delaware. So I'm going to go through some slides and move fairly quickly so we have time for questions on Marissa and I's portion here. So where are we at with energy policy in Delaware? So we're in the sort of tail end of the process for the state's first energy plan since 2009. So we worked on a couple different bills that brought about the process to create the next state energy plan. That was SB 310 a couple years ago that expanded the Governor's Energy Advisory Council to have more environmental interests on that body and others as well that, you know, from our position, we weren't on, but you know, we were able to get in a couple more folks on the environmental side and renewable energy side. And then in the Climate Change Solutions Act, we essentially recreated the Energy Office and changed the timeline and restarted the process on creating the energy plan. So that was created through the Governor's Energy Advisory Council. We were on a couple of the committees for that. It's anticipated that it's going to be quite ambitious, particularly looking back at our last plan compared to this one. A lot has changed in the energy sort of ecosystem in the US and globally since 2009, as you can imagine. And you know, a lot of states that have continued to do plans and meet their plans have gotten way out ahead of us on a number of key energy policies. And so we anticipate, given the amount that we have to catch up, that the plan's going to be relatively ambitious, but it's a 5-year plan. And so it's not like everything's going to get done in year one, right? So there's going to be a number of things: regulatory, administrative, legislative, internal policy. We anticipate a lot of that being included in the energy plan, again, to try and catch up. We did just pass a bill in Delaware. Sierra Club is part of the Power Coalition in Delaware, People for Offshore Wind Energy Resources, led by Peggy Schultz from the League of Women Voters. So, you know, we, along with a number of other partners, are involved in, we're involved in that coalition, and work to advocate around offshore wind. So Delaware would have been the first state actually to do offshore wind back in 2008. But ultimately, there was a number of different issues, but ultimately the economic crisis in 2008, 2009 was sort of the final nail in the coffin on that project. And so that didn't move forward. That would have been, it was called Blue Water Wind. So, you know, after that, we really didn't do anything on offshore wind. And now we've become, you know, the only state, Peggy's probably going to correct me in the chat if I'm wrong on this, but I believe it's North Carolina to Rhode Island. It may have went up to me, I forget, but anyway, of the coastal states from North Carolina up, you know, we were the only one without an active solicitation process underway around offshore wind. So Delaware passed the Energy Solutions Act. That was, we also called that the offshore wind bill, but it did more than just offshore wind. It also looked at transmission infrastructure, right-of-way issues. It did a number of different things that are going to help not just offshore wind, but renewable energy more broadly in Delaware. And the State Energy Office, which was, again, recreated. So the State Energy Office had folded into the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy. And now the Energy Office has been pulled back out of that and made into its own office. Dana Cobb is the director of that office. And they were tasked with developing a solicitation proposal for Delaware. So part of the process, and I told you you'd see this here, the solicitation, its first stop is going to go to the Renewable Energy Task Force. That's the one that I mentioned earlier. And we're on that task force with a couple other good partners. Again, some folks that you know, generally don't agree with too much are on that as well. But so the solicitation proposal goes to the task force for comments and then gets adjusted from there. And then it goes to the Public Service Commission to put their eyes on it, make sure it complies with the state law, and then it will go back to the Energy Office and be worked to put out in solicitation to get bids for an offshore wind project in Delaware. So where we're at right now is they're drafting the solicitation. The Renewable Energy Task Force has not yet gotten that proposal. So that's why I haven't laid out the rest of the process. I'm trying to just talk about sort of where we're at right now. On the transmission side, so transmission infrastructure, we're talking about, you know, the big high voltage lines that folks, well, most folks probably don't even notice them anymore at this point, but when they first got built, everybody's like, oh my God, that's horrible. And some folks still say that, but so we need transmission lines, these high voltage lines, to get power, electricity, electrons from generators, whether it's renewable, you know, fossil based, thermal based, whatever, from those generators to the utilities, the distribution utilities, And then they send that power, they do some things to make it so your home can use it, and then they send it to your home. So we need transmission infrastructure, whether that infrastructure is whatever it's powering, we need transmission infrastructure. Our nation, or even our region, is woefully behind in building out transmission infrastructure, and siting has become a real issue around transmission infrastructure. And a lot of that comes down to opposition groups on the local level. There are some issues with PJM as well, and that's our grid operator in this region, PJM. There's some issues there. They're doing a lot of reforms around interconnections that are still sort of being worked out. They really got approved in May and July. And so there's still, a process to sort of implement all those. And so we're still feeling a lot of contraction and struggling around renewable generation working its way through the interconnection process. But on even, if you were to take that component out of the way, there's still a bigger issue around transmission infrastructure, whether it's tied to the renewables or just, again, those high voltage lines. And there's still, in the interconnection process around, getting these generation facilities online, speaking specifically for renewables, there still seems to be a favoritism towards, what we know, and what we've known historically has been fossil fuel generation. So just as a way, an example, PJM, in an effort to clear out their queue, which is backlog for years of backlog, has selected generators to essentially move to the front of the line of the queue. And the overwhelming majority of those generators, I think it's almost exclusively, are fossil fuel, particularly, natural gas. So, there's still some issue of why did they get hand selected to sort of move to the front of the line? And that it's not really been super clear as to how that happened. So there's still some issues around how does interconnection reform at PJM translate into, more renewable energy, which is the bulk of the queue, bulk of the backlog, actually being built and coming online. But again, even if you remove PJM as the issue, you still have opposition forces in local areas around siting problems. We're dealing with that in Sussex County, which we'll get to in a bit. That still has to be solved. That still has to be worked through. So regionally, there's also energy issues that we've talked about a little bit tonight around a data center conversation. Rate increases are coming on electricity. It's not being talked about a lot, but there was a capacity auction. We're not going to get into too much detail on that for time. But there are auctions in the energy marketplace. Capacity auction is one of them, and the price went from around $20 megawatt to over $200 megawatt, or even higher in some regions. So we're going to see a relatively large increase on folks' electric bills in the coming year. And so, that's from a number of different factors. We already talked about increasing demand from AI and data centers, crypto mining, a number of things. Of course, electrification as well is a component of that, albeit relatively small in comparison to data centers. So you're seeing an increase in demand, but at the same time, you're seeing a decrease in supply. So coal's coming off the line primarily for economical reasons, but of course also from state policy shifts away from, in an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then you still have industries, grappling with supply chain and interest rate issues. And that is on sort of all energy production, but particularly around renewable generation. There's still a big crunch on supply chain and economic pressures left from COVID that came about, again, in part because of supply chain collapses. And then you're seeing, again, that interconnection reforms aren't moving fast, and you have that opposition force on the ground. So there are regional issues that are really big that are impacting our state, and not just our state, but the whole region. So, we have new changes, of course, post-election. We got a new governor coming in. We know at the very least we're going to have a new DNREC secretary, because Sean Garvin has made it abundantly clear that he's not staying through the transition to the new administration. So we know for sure that we're gonna have a new DENREC secretary, but it's likely that there will be other administrative agency changes as well. We also have new leadership in the state house. So Representative Longhurst lost her election during the primary. Her opponent went unchallenged through the general, and so now we have Representative Longhurst was the Speaker of the House. So that created a vacancy for Speaker. Essentially what happened is folks shifted up. So we had Representative Minor Brown, who used to be the majority leader, is now the Speaker. We had Representative Carrie Evelyn Harris, who is the whip, who's now the majority leader, and Representative Ed Ozienski from the Newark area is now the new majority whip. So we have a new House leadership. Ultimately, that's going to impact in some way. We don't know exactly how yet, but it's certainly going to have an impact on our efficiency, efficacy, and our advocacy down in Dover. We had at least communication lines with Representative Longhurst, even though we sort of butted heads at times, several times. But there was a dialogue, and so we sort of need to build those relationships with new House leaders. We have a really good relationship with Representative Ozienski, who's helped out a lot on renewable energy policy in the past. On the federal level, of course, we're likely careening towards a Republican trifecta on the federal level. I don't know if the House has been officially called yet or not. I saw some, broadcasters have, and some say still no. We're not calling it yet. And of course, that is going to lead to a new EPA head, who was the first appointment announced by the Trump administration. And we'll have other administrative agency leadership. Seems like on a daily basis, some horrible pick is coming out. And what we do know is on the EPA side, he appointed somebody that has said multiple times in the past, these three things are the top priorities, being one, going after California's ability to do clean vehicle standards through the Clean Air Act, through a waiver and a process that's been legislated through the Clean Air Act, to go after that and get rid of California's ability to do that, and challenge other states' abilities to jump onto California's standards around air emissions, particularly from vehicles. So that's one. The clean power, the power plant rule. So that was just upheld, and now likely is going to be challenged again, and you have an agency that's going to not fight for it at best, and likely just roll it back or try. And then you have the good neighbor rule, which again was on the chopping block. All three of these things have an impact in Delaware. We have emissions. A lot of our emissions, particularly from electricity generation, are coming from out of state. We're a net importer of energy in Delaware, and a lot of that primarily comes from the west of us. And a lot of that is coal and natural gas, and part of the good neighbor and the power rule that Biden put out and got through was to help reduce those emissions that were crossing state borders and settling primarily in Newcastle and in Delaware, but had impacts elsewhere as well. And so, in a rolling back of those two rules around emissions on the power sector, you have an impact on air quality in Delaware. And then Delaware recently joined the Advanced Clean Cars program, which again, that's that California waiver that is legislated through the Clean Air Act, allows California to set stronger standards around tailpipe emissions. We adopted a modified version of that. That doesn't get out a lot, that we didn't do what California did. We actually did what Colorado did, which is to go to 82% clean vehicles. So that's plug-in hybrids, electric vehicles, and fuel cell vehicles, although infrastructure on fuel cells don't exist really on the East Coast. For light duty. So it was primarily going to be plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles, but we weren't going to 100%. There's a lot of pontification and fear mongering around you're not going to be allowed to buy or own or register or continue to re-register your gas car, and you're going to have to buy an EV, and you're going to have to do all these things. That none of that was true. You weren't going to have to buy an EV, but all the same, point being, if we roll back that program, when we got onto that program, part of that was giving automakers 2 years to start selling those clean cars in Delaware and banking credits for compliance purposes to comply with the program by selling those cars before the program actually kicked in. And we saw a massive influx of EVs available on Delaware lots after joining that program that did not exist before the program was adopted. And it was quite fast that you saw those cars being delivered to Delaware lots. I've had several EVs over my car buying years, and all of them prior to that program, and all of them having to be purchased out of state in areas where they've had that program. So that's going to have impact on vehicle availability likely, and the EV market more broadly. And of course, now they're talking about rolling back the EV tax credit as well. So sort of a full frontal assault on vehicle electrification. So where are we going? So the state energy plan and the climate action plan are sort of our roadmaps of what we want to see in administrative policy, in how we're procuring energy, how we're procuring just paper products, pens, resources, how we're building new facilities for the state. It encompasses a lot of things, as well as what legislative requests do we want to see in the General Assembly over the next 4 to 5 years. So the energy plan hopefully should be out, sometime this month or early next month. Sort of keeps moving a little bit. The climate action plan, they did their first listening sessions, which was really to go out to communities and hear what they need to be more resilient, to help reduce emissions, to help fight what struggles are they having related to climate change, and what resources could the state provide to help, meet those challenges. That was the first round. They're going to compile all of that, come up with some strategies based on all that, and then they're going to go back out again and say, okay, we heard your problems. These are sort of the solutions that we heard that you would like to see. This is how we could implement those. What do you think? And then a draft gets proposed after that, and then that goes out for comment. There'll be more sessions, and then there'll be a final draft, and then that will go out for comment. So there's a lot of opportunities over the next year to be involved in the climate action plan. So some of the topics that are already being discussed that we expect to be in the energy plan, energy storage, that's battery and other short and long duration storage options. How do we increase solar proliferation in Delaware? And that's both on the commercial and the residential side through siting changes, through planning changes, through tax credits. There's a number of different ideas being worked on right now. We're looking at a more holistic approach around EV charging, so encompassing rapid charging options that meet people where they need it, including funding through the NEVI program, which hopefully will get the funding out the door for the next administration comes in. And then additionally, programs through organizations like Energize Delaware that are doing great work around residential charging. You can get insanely cheap EV chargers through Energize Delaware now. And we do an auction every year, and you'll be able to bid on one. So we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. And then looking at energy efficiency and electrification. This is one of those areas I mentioned that we're really far behind. This is one of those areas. So just as a simple example, Maryland, when they look at energy efficiency, they're looking at, the whole portfolio that a utility can offer to do energy efficiency, and how we can reduce emissions through energy efficiency and reduce people's electric bills through energy efficiency. And as long as the whole portfolio is, cost competitive, it's not going to jack people's rates up, then the whole portfolio can move forward, even if one part of the portfolio is a little bit more expensive, but it's offset by another part. As long as the emission reductions are there, then the whole thing can sort of move forward. Delaware doesn't do that. Every single component has to be no cost. And so what ends up happening is you get things that are not really efficient at lowering people's electric bills or reducing emissions. That's what ends up getting through because it's cheap, because it's not effective. And the things that are really good end up dying. Excuse me 1 second. I gotta say goodnight to my daughter. Say night night. Night night. Yeah, I can't. Okay, and so, issues ahead is, funding initiatives, funding for these initiatives is really in question. And so, with the federal government changing, a lot of not exclusively relying on federal funding, but there was a lot of federal funding that were going to help us do a lot of this really good stuff. And so that's a question of how is the state going to step in a situation where you have literally billionaires trying to cut massive amounts from the federal budget and particularly from administrative agencies. How are states going to react and sort of balance that out in the future? On offshore wind, we don't have a timeline on the solicitation. I'm sorry, I'm moving fast, but want to get to questions for folks. So we don't have a timeline, but what we do know is Trump promised on day one that offshore wind would be dead. He said that multiple times over the campaign. The reality is that's not necessarily plausible. You already have some projects that are under contract, some that are under construction, and some that have funding that's already out the door. Those are not likely to be disrupted, but in a situation like Delaware, where we don't have a solicitation out, we need, BOEM to be involved. We need DOE to be involved. We need, state agencies and likely multi-state cooperation. It's a real question on how does Delaware move forward on offshore wind, given that we're so far behind under a Trump administration. What does BOEM even look like? And so that, the leasing processes for future leasing areas is in question. So there's a lot unknown about what's going to happen with offshore wind under the new administration. But what we do know is that there's going to be a much greater need for multi-state solutions and advocacy on the federal level. Delaware tries to convince Trump and his administration by ourselves to, particularly Delaware, given home of Biden, to keep offshore wind around and don't mess around with it. The administration's likely to tell us to pound sand. But if it's multiple states in our region, you got Virginia, you got Maryland, you got New Jersey, you got New York, you got multiple large economies that are all saying collectively, hey, we're going forward on this, and you need to not be a complete and total roadblock. We at least have a better chance than if it was just Delaware. And so multi-state cooperation, regional cooperation, have become very important under the Trump administration. And we also have, again, projects that are already baked, already funding, already ready to start construction, but are being held up. And one instance here, I talked about transmission infrastructure. US Wind is building a project, offshore wind project for Maryland. But the Delmarva Peninsula is sort of key for onshoring renewable generation and helping building out the transmission that we need to move around these clean electrons from offshore wind and other renewable sources. And so, that was a big part of the Energy Solutions Act. And so there's a substation to bring on the clean electrons from this Maryland project that's has been deferred multiple times by Sussex County government, County Council. And the big thing is was mentioned on by one of our members on a previous call is this isn't a Delaware project. Why should Delaware do something? We're in my perspective on that, and you're going to hear me pontificate a lot about this over the coming months. Is if this was a substation for a natural gas facility, we wouldn't have this conversation. We know why we're having this conversation. It's because it's renewable energy, particularly offshore wind. But besides that point, we regionally. We are not an island. We are a peninsula, but we're not an island. And so we have to act like we are not an island. We are in the midst of an energy crisis that's going to get worse and worse as we go along, particularly if we say, well, that's not my project, so why am I going to build a substation next to another substation on a road like that only a power plant exists, right? It's sort of an ideal scenario. And we're still saying no because it's not our project. Well, guess what? Those are electrons, and electrons don't care who's paying for them, right? They go to where the need is first. And so Delawareans are going to use those clean electrons, even though Maryland's paying for them, and they're paying for the substation too, by the way. And so, we're benefiting through an agreement with US Wind that will lower electricity rates by at least $8 a month through the retrieval of renewable energy credits that will help us meet our renewable energy goals and reduce bills for Delawareans. So we're benefiting in that way. There's workforce development. There's jobs that are going to be created in the building and construction of the substation. We're getting economic benefits, even though it's not even our project and we're not paying a dime for it. And it helps resolve some of the issue, at least, around this energy crisis that we've been talking about. And so there's a lot of reasons why should Delaware care? It's not a Delaware project. There's a lot of reasons around that, and you're going to get more of that later. Point being, offshore wind is at a pivotal point, and that it's going to be a key focus for the Delaware chapter. Transportation policies I mentioned, but just briefly again, there's lawsuits pending around clean cars in the state. There's legislative rollbacks that we've been fighting since before the program even passed or got adopted. And so, that's likely to continue. And of course, we're going to have to push back on the Trump administration. Again, this is going to need to be multiple states. You have 40% of the car industry in terms of sales volume that have joined the Clean Cars program. Actually, I think now it's a little bit over 40%. These states are going to need to work together with California if we want to protect that program and continue to reduce emissions from the transportation sector and have more options available on lots in those states. So again, legislative changes may be likely around that, but administrative rollbacks not ruled out given the rollback of the Chevron deference through the Supreme Court. So on the transmission side, Trump positions on FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Trump gets to appoint the chair. It's not clear yet where the outgoing chair is going to step down. The chair currently is a Democrat. Historically, chairs leave. After they're done, they don't go back to just being a non-chair member of FERC. But they haven't, it has happened. So it's not clear yet, but that will decide whether it's sort of a Democratic or Republican controlled FERC. And of course, they regulate, as it says on the screen, I'm not going to read it, but they regulate a lot around transmission. And so transmission that again could become more challenging for renewable energy under a Republican controlled primarily Trump nominated FERC. And then again, regional issues, we have an energy crisis and we need to start acting accordingly and aligning with state policy and goals. All right, so that is the end of sort of where we're going. So I'm going to stop sharing screen. I saw 24 chat messages as I was going, and there's no way I'm going to be able to get caught up and read on that. So if folks want, I see a lot of great conversation. I appreciate it. But if folks have questions, if you want to raise your hand, we have about 5 minutes remaining that I can try to answer some questions. And I'd like questions specific to Marissa and I's presentation at this point of what the chapter sees as sort of priorities and pathways forward and or engagement around Mach 2. I love when I do a presentation, nobody asks questions. Like either I talk way too fast or I was just an amazing presenter and I answered everybody's questions. I think the first one's probably more likely. Yeah, so Anne in the chat, does Delaware have any data centers or AI centers coming to Delaware? So we have had a data center proposed in Delaware in the past. There was actually, I believe, maybe even two. I know there was one in Newark, but I believe there was one proposed in Middletown as well at one time. And those were accompanied by natural gas power facilities to power the data centers as well. And both of those faced extraordinary opposition for a number of different reasons, but at any rate, there's nothing in permitting right now, but there has been in the past. We've seen an explosive growth in logistical centers, not as energy intensive, but also don't want to diminish and make it seem like they're not energy intensive. Depending on what the logistics center is used for, it could be energy intensive. Additionally, there's a lot of particulate matter issues and noise issues around logistical centers. So when you have those too close to housing, it can create a major environmental justice issues. We saw that sort of play out in southern Newcastle County earlier this year. Actually, at the same time, there was a rezoning application around the Delaware City refinery where part of the hydrogen hub network was slated to be, at least according to presentations from OC2 in the past. So not right now, wouldn't put it off the table. I see Coralie has her hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and should have a pop-up to unmute Coralie.
Yeah, I put my hand up and down. I'm unsure, but I'll ask you on, it's more the federal changes, but what do you think are the chances on things like affecting the IRS? Because going back to hydrogen would affect the Treasury's response on that. Since what Trump is likely to do there is put in entirely new people, and he may have undue influence on what would happen with something like making sure that hydrogen is green by not allowing tax cuts for those who are making non-green hydrogen.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the struggles. I mentioned earlier about the EV tax credit. That's something that's been established, been around for quite some time now. And if that's on the if something that's very well established is on the chopping block, I don't have a lot of hope for something that's not yet established, not being on the chopping block. And so, Patrick and I think Dr. Medlinger also maybe mentioned a little bit about tax credit, but Patrick, I know, certainly mentioned that the guidance for the tax credit has really been delayed. And so it's not established. And so you could see a shift in that dynamic, and it would be probably easier to accomplish than getting rid of something that's been pretty well established over the years. So I imagine there's going to be a number of changes around tax credits. For what it's worth, and I'm not trying to be an apologist or anything like that, but not all bad. They're also talking about increasing the child tax credit, which, not in the best way. I mean, they're talking about helping it cover private school expenses, which I'm personally not a fan of, but so you see a lot of conversations around tax credits right now, and not all of them particularly great. I don't know if that answered your question. That's the best thing I have.
Probably as best as we can know now.
Yeah. So, all right, we're at 8 o'clock. I want to respect everybody's time. Folks have already started dropping off. So I just want to plug a couple things. We got a couple things coming up, and I want to make sure folks are aware. We have De-Stress December. And again, I'm going to talk fast to get through them all. De-Stress December on December 3rd. It's a free event. Come out, do some art. We're going to have some art teachers on deck to help folks that aren't, like me, artists, sort of work through a really unique, actually Japanese-inspired theory around art and sort of de-stressing and giving yourself space and that sort of thing. So we have all the crafts. You can bring your own crafts if you want, but we'll have crafts. But we do need folks to register by next Wednesday if you're going to come, because I have to buy the craft supplies. I want to buy a bunch and then folks don't show up. So it is a free event. I would love folks to come. It's at the Route 9 Library. Marissa, if you're able to find the link to put it in the chat, that'd be great. We'll include it in the follow-up. So December 3rd, Marissa's at 5 o'clock.
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Yeah, we'll follow up on that. So, but December 3rd in the evening at Route 9 Library.
Yeah.
So free art event there. We have a stargazing event on December 30th. It's $10 at the Mount Cuba Observatory, and that they charge $10. It's not us charging $10. So folks want to sign up for that. And then we have our end of the year auction. It's our biggest fundraiser of the year. It's how we fund all the work that we've been talking about tonight. And so if folks are interested, it starts on Black Friday. It runs through December 9th. And so you can bid on some really great items. We have, a beautiful Sleeps 15 vacation home that somebody donated in North Carolina. We have one a little bit closer to home in Bethany Beach, smaller though. Bike equipment, bike itself. We have a lot of gift cards to breweries and local businesses and bookstores and just, you name it. There's kind of something for everybody there. So you'll see, emails coming out about that. If you're getting the emails that we send out, great. Thank you for doing that. Please don't unsubscribe. If you unsubscribe to National's emails, you are also unsubscribed to ours. If you don't get our email, go to sierraclub.org/Delaware, and on our homepage, I made a video about how you can resubscribe to our state emails without getting bombarded by national emails. So good tool for folks if you're not getting our emails right now. There's also a newsletter sign up on the sidebar, and that's a real quick way to do it. We are not doing a lot of our committee meetings in December, but we are going to start back up in January, and we're hoping that into February, we'll actually start doing more in-person committee meetings. We have a lot of work ahead of us, as you have seen during tonight's presentation. And I think it's important that we're in community together. So we're going to offer hybrid for as many opportunities as we can on committee meetings. So we'll have sort of a mix of virtual, hybrid, and in person if it's something that just can't be done hybrid. So looking forward to getting back together in person on the other side of the holiday break. We are doing a lot of work with the incoming administration, hopefully to help guide policies in the right direction. There's a lot on the table right now, and a lot of work to be done. So if you want to get involved, there's a volunteer survey on our website that connects you with Jack and Liz, who do our onboarding for us. And we'll set up a one-on-one meeting with you. So encourage you again, sierraclub.org/Delaware. There's a volunteer link that should be good to go on there. So thank you to our speakers. I know Patrick had to leave, but throw it out into the ether. Thanks to Patrick for coming out. Thanks to Dr. Medlinger for coming out from the center. Really appreciate it, and thank Dr. Jan for me for sending me out or offering you up, so to speak. And thank, of course, everybody for coming out tonight and listening to this presentation. I hope it was helpful, and I hope to see everybody more involved. Hopefully we'll get to do art together on the 3rd. So thank you all very much for coming out tonight.